Hello and welcome to Transfermarkt. I'm your host Manuel Veth. He's Stefan Bienkowski. Stefan, and today's topic is Liverpool. 10th in the league, 29 points. They're behind the likes of Brentford and Fulham. Where has it all gone wrong for them?
It's a very big question, Manu, which we'll obviously try and get to the bottom of in this episode. I think you can definitely point to some, in the very immediate term, some problems with certain players. Some players aren't scoring very well, some players aren't defending very well. But I think the
Mm,
crux of the issue comes from the way this team has been built, over the last 4 or 5 seasons. If you kind of
yeah.
go onto the Transfermarkt website and look at the kind of players that they've been buying, the positions that they've been buying in, I think it's really quite telling as to the priorities the club have had and whether those priorities have got them into this mess. Over the last 5 seasons, they've managed to pick up 7 forwards, 6 defenders, 3 goalkeepers, but just 4 central midfielders. And while those 4 central midfielders have cost them 131 million euros, that's almost half what they spent on forwards in that time, which is even worse when you consider the fact that
Mm,
those 4 forwards are Fabinho, Thiago Alcantara, Keita, and of course Arthur Melo, who came on loan from Juventus. And at least
yeah.
maybe 3 of those players have really struggled for game time. Keita has been a disaster at Liverpool. Thiago Alcantara is a very good player, as we know, but as some people have suggested, he's almost made of glass in terms of his availability.
Mm,
And Fabinho, who's perhaps been the best pound for pound signing out of the 4 of them, has actually had to fill in elsewhere for much of his time at Liverpool. Famously a couple of seasons ago, he basically spent the whole season playing in central defence. So if you're kind of looking at where the money's been spent in that squad and the positions that they have, reinforced time and time again, it definitely suggests that Jurgen Klopp or the people who are making these decisions at the club have over prioritized the forward positions. Even just this season, we've seen Darwin Núñez
mm,
signed in the summer. 6 months later, Gakpo arrives from PSV when that team is crying out for midfielders, perhaps even crying out for defenders, which is perhaps really quite interesting when you consider that the kind of key players in that Jurgen Klopp team over the course of his tenure at the club have been in defence in the sense of, Virgil van Dijk has been a stalwart at the back. He's one of the best central defenders.
mm.
Okay, that's perhaps why they haven't had to sign as many central defenders as they have midfielders, but they've also kind of managed to build an entire kind of dynasty off that attacking duo of Sadio Mane and Mohamed Salah. Now, of course, Sadio Mane's moved on, but number of forward
Mm.
players that have been signed over the last 2 seasons alone certainly suggests just some complete blindsidedness in terms of that midfield, and it definitely
Yeah.
seems to me as if something's gone wrong with the squad planning at the club and why that midfield is so bereft of genuine quality, genuine stars, and why the team continues to struggle on the pitch.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. You mentioned some of the spending, right? We pulled up the Transfermarkt statistics, and when you look at the squad spending, what was it over the last few years? Then they're actually ninth in the Premier League table, which is exactly where they are. And this year they spent less than a club like Leeds United, the club that we just discussed earlier, right? So it's kind of maybe some of the fans will argue that they are exactly where they are in terms of spending. And when you look at places like Twitter, I know it's not a real representation of the world. You see, Liverpool fans quite adamant that the club needs to spend more, that the owners FSG need to spend more. I would argue that some of this maybe comes also down on just the way that the squad has been constructed. And Stefan, you and I have followed Jurgen Klopp's career for quite some time, and I personally look at this and the way the team has been put together, and it's been initially put together successfully, and then aging stars are kind of aging out, right? And you had this really long period of success, and then all of a sudden you have to bring in new players and maybe change also the way you're playing. And I still think that Darwin Núñez bringing him in and selling Sadio Mane and making money off him, right, from Bayern Munich, those are smart moves from an economic part, an economic way, but also in some ways suggest that Jurgen Klopp realized that he had to change the way he's playing, and it always feels like that is exactly around that time when Jurgen Klopp struggles. And you see it with the way he's behaving. He's lashed out against the media. James Pearce was the latest victim, right? He said he wouldn't answer his question at a press conference. You and I've seen this before. It seems like this is always around the time when Jurgen Klopp, I don't want to see loses the plot, but maybe loses a little bit sense of direction. And this is probably also for him a very crucial time. And lots of parallels to Borussia Dortmund, right?
Oh yeah, without a doubt. He's obviously a very kind of honest, open guy, and he wears emotions on his sleeves to an extent. So when things are going well, he's a very happy, very huggy, very smiley guy. But when things are going bad, he
Yeah.
struggles to hide that contempt or that anger, that frustration. And I do think these are all kind of linked. As I kind of said a couple of minutes ago, if you look at the type of players they've signed and the positions that they've signed in, that kind of couples quite well with the fact that the club itself have, for one reason or another, refused to pay as much money on new players as their main contenders in the league, whether it be not even just Manchester City or Chelsea, but even teams like Arsenal perhaps or Tottenham. They've struggled to keep up with them in terms of their net spend. And the thing that and then so
Mm.
if you're talking about a club here who are actually spending money like a mid-table team, they have to be extremely efficient in terms of the players they buy. They have to be extremely efficient in terms of the kind of squad depth they have in each position, much like a team like Brentford perhaps, who are very
Mm.
good at maybe outsmarting teams who have a bigger budget. Liverpool just simply haven't been able to do that, and that's also where maybe the comparisons are drawn to Dortmund, where Klopp's team were
Yeah.
constantly having a battle against a Bayern Munich side who had a much bigger squad, much better players, and a much bigger transfer budget each summer. And as we saw at Dortmund, he had that great kind of generation of players that came through, all very young, all kind of came through at the same time. All came from relative little, unknown backgrounds in terms of the clubs they came from. But once that kind of generation were either sold or they got too old, that's when the wheels began to fall off because either he or his scouting team at Dortmund were unable to kind of find like for like replacements. And you can perhaps kind of see that kind of happening here at Liverpool as well, even where they have chose to spend money on the likes of Darwin Núñez as a kind of de facto replacement for Sadio Mane, if you will, or Gakpo. Maybe Gakpo's a bit unfortunate to kind of criticise him just now because he's only just arrived at the club, but you can even maybe look at guys like Luis Diaz,
Mm.
Ibrahima Konate, Diogo Jota. Like these are all guys that the club have kind of decided, like, right, we're going to go splash our budget on these guys because they're going to be our next Van Dijks, they're going to be our next, Mohamed Salahs or whatever else you want to call it. And whether it's down to injury or just a
Mm.
lack of form or lack of confidence, they haven't been able to kind of replicate the magic of that first team that Klopp was able to put together. And I think that's perhaps where the kind of succinct kind of comparisons to Dortmund are made.
Mm. I think sometimes also overlooking certain warning signs like Ibrahima Konate, Thiago, and Naby Keita even all came with a history of injuries, right? And
Mm.
this history of injuries was almost overlooked in a sense because that made the players also available for a certain price. And it almost seems like that Liverpool are betting on the transfer market, right? And while those bets paid off early on, it feels like they're not paying off anymore, which then also leads to the question, how much longer will Jurgen Klopp be able to sustain this? I know that he still has a very strong backing by FSG, the ownership, right? He still has the backing of the majority of the media. You look at outlets like the Liverpool Echo, who have recently publicly backed him, right? Which is very uncommon for large media groups to back a struggling manager. If you compare this to other large clubs, I think the manager would be very much in question. But we do have to ask this question, Stefan. What's next for Jurgen Klopp? Is he going to be able to sustain this pressure? Will he be just able to say, okay, well, I'm going not to do what I did at Dortmund and step down and give someone else the rebuild. He will try himself. I guess this is really the final question here. What is going to happen to Jurgen Klopp?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because if you even go back maybe 2 or 3 years, he was being linked with the Germany job. He was being touted as perhaps a replacement to Jogi Löw before Hansi Flick took the job. And he was very diplomatic with his responses to that, and there was possibly links to Bayern Munich and whoever else. And there were some great concerns that perhaps Liverpool wouldn't be able to keep this extremely talented, ambitious head coach. But then he signed a new contract, and he currently has a contract with the club until
Yeah.
2026, which is a huge, huge contract for any head
Mm.
coach. So he definitely showed his commitment to the club back then. But I do kind of wonder if things have changed quite a lot since then. There's obviously been a lot of murmurs about the fact that the owners of the club may be looking to sell, and then that kind of changed very quickly to no, we don't want to sell. We just want to bring in more investors to help us run the club. And as you said a moment ago, if you jump on Twitter for even 5 minutes, the vitriol that fans have towards the ownership right now and the way that they're running things is certainly palpable. And it keeps bringing me back to what happened at Dortmund. He wasn't sacked at Dortmund. It wasn't a great big dramatic end of season, point where he says I'm out of here. It was a kind of like he just kind of resigned himself to defeat, maybe basically halfway through the season. It seemed as though all this frustration, all this anger that had been building up in press conferences just kind of seemed to get the better of him. And he said, "Look, I've done all I can here," and almost for his own sanity, he's like, "I'm going to move on at the end of the season. I'll give the club plenty of time to look for a replacement," and that's what he did at Dortmund, despite everything he achieved there. And I do kind of fear if things can continue going as they are at Dortmund, and as they are at Liverpool, and there's not really any suggestion that things will turn around very quickly unless there's a huge injection of cash in the summer, then we might be seeing something similar. I mean, Klopp doesn't strike me as the kind of guy who, will just dramatically drop off or fall out or leave a club. He'll probably turn around and say, I can't help the situation anymore, and that's maybe when he resigns himself. So as things stand, it seems to me as though he may move on in the near future, or towards maybe, or certainly maybe after this season, if things don't improve dramatically, because it seems like this club's just kind of sucking the soul out of him at the moment. And as we saw at Dortmund, that's when he decided to call it quits.
Yeah, it's been a long time that he's been at Liverpool. I think it's not surprising that at some point managers wear off. It always happens. It doesn't matter how successful you've been. At some point, it is. Liverpool is a very emotional club, very similar, a lot of parallels to Borussia Dortmund, right? And then that emotion takes a lot out of you. And I find that very parallel, these outbursts towards journalists, reporters. I find those very interesting. It feels like it's something that I've seen before, and I'm very curious how it plays out. But this is it from us today. We'll be back soon with more content. Go and check out Transfermarkt. You can check out all the latest rumors, all the latest transfers. You can check out all the stats regarding Liverpool. Then you can check out the latest fixtures, the upcoming fixtures. Everything is right there. Go ahead, check it out now. We'll be back soon. Until then, cheers and bye-bye.